Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to do something incredibly ambitious. We are going to distill 5,000 years of turbulent, deeply resilient Korean history into a single, cohesive narrative. If you've ever wanted to truly understand the forces that shaped one of the most dynamic, divided, and frankly fascinating regions on Earth, well, you are absolutely in the right place.
Now, what's really fascinating here is the massive paradox we're looking at today. Think about it. You have a region with a unified ancient ancestral identity, a people who literally shared the same land, language, and traditions for millennia. Yet today, they're defined by a stark, heavily militarized geopolitical division. So how exactly did we get here? To answer that, we really have to go back to the very beginning. Okay, so here's our structural roadmap for today. We'll quickly cover their shared roots and early kingdoms, move into the dynasties and golden ages, discuss the trauma of occupation and resistance, the tragedy of the Korean War, and finally look at the one peninsula, two paths they've taken since. Let's jump right into part one, shared roots and early kingdoms. We're going to start by looking at the deep foundational roots of the Korean people, way before modern borders ever existed. So human presence on the Korean Peninsula actually dates back over 500,000 years. We're talking early hunter-gatherers using simple flake tools made out of quartz pebbles. Then, around 10,000 years ago, as the climate warmed up, we see this crucial shift. The Neolithic era brought permanent settlements, marine fishing, and the domestication of plants. And it's this agricultural bedrock that eventually paved the way for the Bronze and Iron Ages, which is exactly where we see the very first primitive societies and early kingdoms, like Joseon, start taking shape. And when we hit about the 1st century AD, we see these three distinct cultural flavors emerge during the Three Kingdoms period. Notice how incredibly diverse they were. Up north, you've got Goguryeo, which was just this massive military powerhouse that actually successfully repelled huge invasions from the Chinese Sui dynasty. Then over on the west coast, you have Baekje. They had a huge maritime focus and used abundant mulberry trees for advanced sericulture. They were creating these beautiful floral pattern textiles and even exporting them to Japan. Finally, in the southeast, Silla leveraged its nomadic roots for horse ranching while advancing in bronze metallurgy to solidify its ruling class. Basically, three totally distinct identities, all sharing one peninsula. Moving on to part two, dynasties and golden ages. As we fast forward through thousands of years, we arrive at the golden ages of unification, the era that truly solidified a distinctly Korean identity. The big takeaway here is the immense stability and the incredible cultural blossoming that happened once the peninsula unified. Back in 668 AD, Silla, allied with the Tang Dynasty, unified the region and kicked off a total golden age of maritime trade and architecture. This transitioned in 918 AD to the Goryeo Dynasty, which, by the way, is where we get the modern name Korea. It was a deeply Buddhist state that really prized learning and unified the Han tribes. Eventually, in 1392, General Yi Sang-gae established the Joseon Dynasty. This was a major shift. They moved the state ideology from Buddhism to Confucianism, and it established a framework of humane government that would last for over 5 whole centuries. During these golden ages, some absolutely incredible cultural anchors were forged. I mean, we're talking about the invention of the komongo, a 6-string zither supposedly crafted from an enchanted mulberry tree, and the 12-string keagum. Both of these are still staples of traditional Korean music today. We also see majestic Buddhist temples and the monumental casting of lotus Buddha statues that were meant to protect the nation. Later on, the Joseon Dynasty's adoption of that human-centered Confucian philosophy brought profound social order to the region. And perhaps most importantly, scholars actually devised writing symbols that dramatically increased literacy among everyday commoners. It all just points to a civilization incredibly rich in art, faith, and philosophy. Which brings us to part 3, occupation and resistance. Sadly, that 500 years stability of the proud Joseon Dynasty eventually gave way to the encroaching imperialism of the early 20th century. Now, the number 35 represents a profoundly dark chapter. It marks 35 traumatic years of Japanese colonization, starting right in 1910. After centuries of successfully fending off Mongol and Manchu invasions, Korea lost its sovereignty, and the occupying forces systematically attempted to completely erase Korean identity. The weight of this occupation was just devastating. Japanese forces imposed these incredibly strict assimilation policies. Celebrating Korean culture in public? Outlawed. Even Korean names and the Korean language itself were banned and replaced by Japanese.
Plus, there was rampant exploitation of labor from mines and factories. But the resilience of the Korean spirit was tested and proved totally unbreakable. On March 1, 1919, this massive, widespread, peaceful protest erupted. The military crackdown was brutal, though. Over 7,000 Koreans were murdered and tens of thousands were arrested. Yet this tragedy only galvanized the nation, strengthening independence movements both at home and abroad.
But, this powerful push for self-determination echoed globally. Korean organizers literally traveled across the world, establishing networks as far away as the United States and lobbying at the peace conference in Paris. Even though they faced massive international political hurdles, they proved definitively that the Korean desire for sovereignty could not and absolutely would not be crushed. And that leads us into Part 4, the Korean War. Liberation finally came in 1945, bringing immense hope, but it was almost immediately shattered by the geopolitical realities of the emerging Cold War. The 38th parallel. This became the fateful line. It was originally just drawn up by the Allied powers as a temporary measure to divide the peninsula into an American occupation zone in the south and a Soviet occupation zone in the north, simply to oversee the Japanese surrender. But, as we know, this temporary line very quickly hardened into a permanent and tragic division.
So both sides of this line rapidly developed into Cold War proxies. Up north, you had Kim Il-sung, backed by the Soviet Union, establishing a communist regime heavily reliant on a Stalinist model. Down in the south, Syngman Rhee, backed by the United States, formed an anti-communist nationalist government. Now, impartially speaking, both leaders consolidated their own respective forms of authoritarian control, and neither had any intention of seeking unification by peaceful means. The stage was set for an inevitable, tragic collision. And that collision officially happened on June 25, 1950, when North Korea invaded the South. The back and forth was absolutely devastating. North Korean forces pushed all the way down to Busan before the UN, led by the US, launched a massive counteroffensive at Incheon in September. That pushed forces all the way back up to the Yalu River. But then, the intervention of hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops in November pushed the UN forces right back down. What followed was a brutal war of attrition. Just to put it into perspective, it destroyed 2/3 of their entire national wealth and infrastructure, eventually ending in a bitter 1953 armistice that finalized the division we see today. And finally, Part 5, One Peninsula, Two Paths. Following that 1953 armistice, these two halves of a once unified nation embarked on drastically different trajectories. The contrast in the systems they adopted was incredibly stark. The North went all in on a rigid Stalinist model. We're talking heavy land confiscation, state agricultural farms, and extreme military mobilization under the continued rule of the Kim family. The South, on the other hand, took a totally different route. After a period of political instability, South Korea transitioned into a developmental democracy. They kicked off massive state-led economic development plans, pouring focus into heavy industries, electronics, and global market integration. Now, the results in the South, they've been nothing short of an economic miracle. Get this. South Korea's real GDP has grown 65-fold since 1953. To put that in perspective, they took an absolute war-torn ruin, a country that back in 1961 was actually poorer than Ghana, and transformed it into the 10th largest economy in the world today. They've become a massive global technology power, seamlessly transitioning from a third-world nation to an OECD heavyweight in record time. So we return to the core paradox of modern Korea. It's truly staggering when you step back and look at it. Here is a fiercely resilient culture that survived ancient tribal conflicts, repelled massive Sui dynasty armies, endured Mongol invasions, and completely outlasted harsh colonial erasure. Yet today, this singular ancient identity is fractured by modern global geopolitics, defined by what is arguably the most extreme economic and political contrast anywhere on Earth. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought. With the strict ideological controls of the past now facing the relentless pressures of our modern, globalized world, what does the next chapter hold for this divided peninsula? Will the deep, shared 5,000-year heritage of the Korean people eventually pull them back together? Or will the divergent paths of the last 70 years prove just too wide to bridge? Thank you so much for learning with me today, and as always, keep asking the big questions.